And just like that, we have a new championship leader. Lando Norris takes home the victory to cap off a perfect weekend. In a weekend that puts him in first place in the driver's standings. Is Lando now the favorite to win the championship? And why has the gap been so big to his teammate Oscar Piastri lately, who had another disappointing weekend in Mexico City? It was a good recovery drive from Max Verstappen on Sunday, but overall, a disappointing weekend. In a weekend that could take him out of contention for the championship. And it was some good, some bad for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc finishes P2, but Lewis Hamilton, incident after incident, a penalty, some floor damage. Is there any hope for Ferrari for the rest of the season coming out of Sunday? We have a lot to talk about coming out of a very exciting and eventful Mexico City Grand Prix. And it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Man, that was a good one. I feel like it always happens this way where I go into a race weekend thinking, Sunday might be pretty boring. We might not get a lot of overtakes. We might not get a lot of action on track. And those races somehow end up being the most exciting. And the races I do go into excited about, thinking we are going to get the action, we are going to get the overtakes, those end up being the snooze fest. And that's exactly what happened this weekend in Mexico City, because I came into the weekend thinking, Lap 1 could be a little chaotic, but after that, it's going to calm down. There's not going to be a lot going on. And I was wrong on that because we had so much action during this race, so much going on, so hard to keep up as the race was going on. Let's start from the top with that Lap 1 chaos because we got a lot of action going into Turn 1 on Lap 1. Of course, Lando Norris gets a great start off the line and really the perfect start for him. But it's so hard to keep the lead going into Turn 1 from pole. And that's why we've only seen one other instance before this year in the last 4 years where the pole sitter holds on to the lead coming out of Turn 3. But Lando gets a great start, gets a little bit of an edge over the two Ferraris, but they get the slipstream behind him. I think it was Charles first and then Lewis behind Charles. But both of those Ferraris go side by side. They try to go side by side with Lando. Lando edges him out a little bit going into Turn 1, but then here comes Max Verstappen on the outside, almost 4 wide going into Turn 1. You knew something was going to happen. 4 cars are not going to fit through these corners. And Max Verstappen locks up his tires on the outside, goes off into the grass, somehow doesn't crash into the barriers, which I don't know how he maintained that speed on that grass and didn't slide into the wall and end his race. But he goes off track. Comes back in. I think he came out in third, maybe second or third. Actually, no, third. He came out behind Lando coming out of Turn 3. He ends up going back into fourth, giving the position back to the Ferrari of Lewis Hamilton. But he doesn't get a penalty for that incident. And George Russell was chirping on the radio, very unhappy about all of this. I don't really think George had a point. I don't think George had any chance of getting around Max going into Turn 1. And I think that's why the stewards didn't give Max a penalty. He was clearly behind Max in just that line of the 4 cars in front. So I thought it was a fair call by the stewards to not give Max a penalty for that moment. Oscar, though, of course, starts all the way back in P7, actually qualified P8, but then gets bumped up a position because of Carlos Sainz's 5-place grid drop. But he's in the middle of it, in the thick of it, and that really hurt his race because a driver in his position with so much on the line in the championship, you can't afford to pick up any damage. You can't afford to ruin your race in that moment, especially being surrounded by cars that are much slower than you and cars that you should be able to get ahead of as the race goes on. And that really hurt Oscar's race because he did lose that position to Yuki Tsunoda in that moment. And we saw, I think it took until lap 11 before Oscar was finally able to get ahead of Yuki, who was much slower on those medium tires. But that really hurt Oscar's race, and that's why the qualifying result on Saturday was so disappointing for him, because you knew it was going to be chaotic going into Turn 1, and you knew he was going to have to play it safe, and you knew something like that could happen, and something that could really hurt his race and really stop him from moving up the field. But we had another incident going into Turn 1 between Liam Lawson and one of the Williams, I think it was Carlos Sainz, where it was just a racing incident. I don't think there was any fault on either driver, but Liam Lawson ends up with a broken wing, tries to stick it out for a few more laps, ends up coming into the pits. And then we got a really scary moment with the marshals who came out. We have Liam's broken wing. I think it was in the grass on turn in between turn 1 and 2 in that area. But they run out onto the track to get that damage, pick up the wing as Liam is coming out of the pits after switching out his front wing. And we have a really scary incident where he literally breezes right by these marshals running off the track. Now, credit to Liam for seeing those two individuals on track before he gets to that corner and still slowing down and doing that in the heat of the moment in the race conditions. But just an incident that cannot happen. Now, of course, these marshals are volunteers. It's not like we're talking about FIA employees who have gone through weeks and all of this training and know exactly how to handle these situations. And that's the downfall of having volunteer marshals, on track during this. They're sometimes going to make mistakes like that, and they could go onto the track on the wrong time. But just a really, really scary moment to have just two human beings on track as these cars are zooming by. And just a situation that cannot happen. And hopefully the FIA takes corrective action and makes sure that doesn't happen again. But things continue after that. And then we get another incident between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton on lap 6. A little bit of flashbacks to 2021. But going into turns 2 and 3, they go wheel to wheel. I think Max ends up going for the dive bomb on Lewis. They bang wheels. Max goes off track. Doesn't get a penalty for it, though. Stays ahead of Lewis. And then that fight continues going down into turn 4. They go side by side again into that corner. Lewis goes off track this time. Doesn't use the escape road. Still comes out ahead. And Lewis gets a 10-second penalty for that. I thought the penalty for Lewis was fair. I didn't think 10 seconds was fair. I think it should have been 5 seconds. But I thought the FIA and the stewards were very clear about what would happen in turn 4 if you didn't use that escape road. And it was laid out for the drivers, and they knew they had to follow it. And Lewis looks like he tried to follow that escape road. Now, the escape road needs some work. That thing is way too skinny, and I don't know if it was intentional by the FIA. I don't know if it was just the track characteristics, and it was, hey, this is what we're going to deal with today with the runoff road and the escape road. But Lewis probably deserved a penalty for that, because I thought it was very clear that drivers were not going to be allowed to do that, and they were going to get a penalty. But interestingly, Lewis didn't get the penalty for not using the escape road. He got the penalty for gaining an advantage by going off track, which I guess it all arises out of the same incident, but still, a little inconsistency from the stewards. But I thought Max deserved a penalty too for what he did going into turn 2 and 3. Clearly went off track, stayed ahead, kept position, and he banged wheels into Lewis. Now, I think what probably helped Max in that situation was Lewis didn't get any damage from that incident. It wasn't something that necessarily ruined Lewis's race. Now, Lewis's race did get a little bit ruined by his incident of going off the grass and going into turn 4, which gave him some floor damage. But personally, I would have liked to see both drivers get a penalty in that situation, but it's what you get with the stewards sometimes, and it, I guess, gives us some talking points after the race. But after that, things calmed down a little bit, and it became a lot more of a strategy race. And we got a lot of different strategies at play during this Grand Prix. And those are the best races for the fans, because we don't want to see the races where it's, all right, everybody start on mediums. On lap 25, we're all going to come into the pits. All the other teammates, you're going to have to come in on lap 26. Everyone switches to hard tires, and it's just all the same. We don't get any excitement out of those. And especially at tracks where it's difficult to overtake. It was a little easier here, but for any track, when we have mixed up strategies, it always makes the racing so much better. Now, most of the drivers in this race started on the soft tires, went to the mediums, but then for a lot of them, that turned into an unexpected 2-stop race where they came in for another set of softs. That was, of course, triggered by Oscar Piastri, who came in. They jumped on the radio, were entertaining the idea of coming in to overtake. I think that triggered Kimi Antonelli to come in at the same time, so they weren't caught out. Lewis Hamilton came in too. I think he was starting to struggle on his tires, but then everyone else had to react to that too. Little interesting there. I think I would have liked to see some of those drivers try to stick it out, thinking we're going to get a 22-second, 23-second advantage out of all these drivers coming in for the pits. Do we really need to? Now, it looked like it was the right call because we saw just how easy it was for Max Verstappen to close in on Charles Leclerc at the end of that race. But I would have liked to see some people just roll the dice and see if they could stay ahead and see if it was the better strategy to stay out. But then we also had other strategies. We had a handful of drivers starting on the mediums, switching over to the softs, which that one probably was the best strategy for the race. But then we had a handful of other drivers who opted for the hard tires at the start of the race. And that was clearly a mistake. Just way too slow this weekend. Alex Albon came on the radio. He was one of the drivers who started on the hards and then switched to the soft tires. Told his pit wall it was the worst strategy ever. We've gotten a lot of sassy radio messages from Alex Albon. But any driver who went on the hard tires this weekend, clearly a mistake for Sunday. But at least it gave us a lot of excitement, and it gave us a lot of shuffling. And it's fun, too, when a race is like that, and you're trying to figure out how these strategies are all going to play out, and you really don't know what the order is going to be until the very end. So, good for the fans. Some of those strategies, though, not so good for the drivers. But then we got another interesting incident at the end of the race. Of course, all of this is coming down. We have Oscar Piastri closing in on the Mercedes ahead of him. We've got Max Verstappen closing in on Charles Leclerc ahead of him. And it looks like both of them are going to catch both of those drivers they were chasing down and get ahead of them. And they had the tires to do so. But then Carlos Sainz has an interesting incident in the stadium section. He just loses it coming around one of the curbs. They had a very difficult car this weekend. Just a car that didn't have any pace, but a car that also had a lot of just weird technical errors going on. We saw it with Carlos Sainz coming into the pits, and I guess it was his pit limiter just not working in his favor and just not working out for him. But regardless, in those final laps, he just loses it coming around one of the corners in the stadium section. Spins out, slides into the wall, and then I guess he just called it from there. Thought, all right, my race is over. I don't know if there was any terminal damage that was going to force him to retire, but regardless, he made the decision to retire, or the team made the decision to retire. And he's right there in the escape road. Goes ahead, pulls off track. Doesn't get all the way off track, but gets his car halfway behind the barrier wall. And then we get a VSC. And a VSC that really ruined the end of that race because it cut out that last lap battle between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. It cut out that opportunity for Oscar Piastri to gain some positions. And I don't know if a VSC was warranted right there. Now, you do have marshals getting out on track and trying to push Carlos Sainz's car all the way off track, so I guess they would have to get behind. They're on track. You have that switchback corner where cars, if they go off, they're going to go right into the marshals and Carlos Sainz parked car. So I do understand it to some extent, but I think I would have rather him just told the marshals, hey, just leave the car there for a second. Let's do a double yellow. Let's not do a VSC, because that really took a lot of opportunities away at the end of the race and took a lot of excitement away from the fans as well. But this race was all about Lando Norris and just an incredible weekend by him. Now, of course, he was helped out a lot by getting pole position, but a lot of credit to him for putting together a perfect qualifying lap on Saturday that gave him that opportunity. And a lot of credit to him, too, for getting the lead coming out of those first few corners, because it's not easy at this track. And he needed to nail that start. He needed to get the inside line. He clearly did his homework, saw how Max Verstappen did it back in 2022. And that paid huge dividends for Lando, because once he got ahead, he was in clear air, and he really, really started pulling away. I think he was benefited greatly by those two Ferraris behind him, who started lifting and coasting right away. Lando's lead was 10 seconds by lap 23. He had so much more pace, just so much more in that car, and just an incredible weekend by him. And an incredible performance by him, too, coming out of a very disappointing weekend at the United States Grand Prix. Now, he did make his way up the order on Sunday and get a good result out of Sunday in Austin, but disappointing Saturday for him, getting knocked out of the sprint race, and just an overall disappointing weekend for him and the team, losing so much to Max Verstappen. This was exactly what Lando needed, and just a very, very strong weekend. And it reminds us of the Lando that we used to see before the pressure started getting to him for the championship fight, and back when he's just going back to being a pure racer and going back to his instincts and not thinking too much about the pressure of the moment, doing things the right way, and just that's where we see those errors from Lando. But when we see him relax like this, we see a very strong driver, and a driver that is very capable of winning the championship. Is Lando now the favorite to win the championship, though? I think this was a very important result for him just with Max Verstappen alone, because Max wasn't able to gain any ground on him. Max is now 36 points behind Lando in the driver's standings. With just 4 race weekends to go, we have 4 Grand Prix, 2 sprint races, so there is a lot of opportunity for Max to make up some ground. But he's going to need a lot of help to do that. And we're going to tracks. Brazil is the next one. Very favorable for McLaren. Then we go to Vegas. Probably not McLaren's best track and probably one of the worst tracks on the calendar. So an opportunity for Max to gain some ground there. But I think that's going to be a weekend where we see the Mercedes look very strong and maybe even get the win during that Grand Prix on that Sunday, or Saturday night actually, in Vegas. But then we're off to Qatar. A very strong track for the McLaren and could be a very strong track for Lando. And then we're off to Abu Dhabi. Another strong track for Lando. Now we could see Max gain some ground there, but will it be too late for him in that moment? The thing is, Lando really just needs to worry about Oscar at this point. I don't think he needs to keep an eye on Max, but I don't think he really needs to worry that much about Max. But with Oscar, I think that's why you need to look at Lando as the favorite for the championship, because the last 5 race weekends, Lando has outscored Oscar every single weekend. And it's just been so many disappointing results from Oscar lately, and he doesn't look comfortable at all in this car. Now we are going to Brazil, which has been a very strong track for Oscar. It's also been a strong track for Lando too. So that'll be a very important weekend. Of course, with a sprint race too on Saturday, a lot of points up in the air. And it'll be very interesting to see exactly where Oscar, just where his performance is for that weekend, because it has not been good for him lately. Starting this season, I think he qualified or finished in the top 3, 15 out of the 16 first races. He had that P3 in Singapore, but he hasn't finished in the top 3 after that. And it just hasn't been the Oscar Piastri that we've been used to. In this weekend, he did not look comfortable at any point in this car. Could not get any pace, just could not get the most out of the car going through the corners. And Lando was clearly ahead of him. And there's just been a lot going on with Oscar that's very concerning if you're an Oscar fan, if you're Mark Webber, hoping he can avenge all of your troubles at Red Bull with Sebastian Vettel and win that championship for you. But things are not looking good for Oscar at all. And he made some interesting comments after the race saying the car's changed enough for him lately where he's driving in an unnatural way. And the car itself hasn't changed because we know McLaren haven't brought any upgrades for a very long time this season, has fully switched their focus to 2026. So nothing has really changed with Oscar as far as the car. Now, of course, the conspiracy theorists are coming out saying, oh, well, they must be sabotaging the car. They're not doing that. McLaren's not doing that. We've seen McLaren play this whole championship fight between these drivers and try to be as fair as possible and probably overly fair between these two drivers instead of letting them race. They're not going to be a team that sabotages Oscar's car. Oscar has the same car as Lando right now. Lando's just doing a much better job, and I think a lot of this comes down to setup, and Lando has just figured out, and I think the team has helped him too, and he's made some comments that kind of allude to that, but I think he's just gotten ahead of Oscar with the setup of the car, and he's gotten the car in just a much better operating window for his driving style. But I think another thing too is we're getting to these later races, when we're in the European summer, we're at tracks where Oscar has had a lot of experience in the Junior Series, F2, F3, all of the series before that, where we were at tracks where he's raced plenty of times before. He knows how to approach each corner. He knows where the sweet spots are on the track, and he knows how to extract everything out of the car. Now we're going to races where he doesn't have as much experience. He has a couple Grand Prix under his belt from his last 2 years in F1, but not what he's had at those European races, and I think that's going a long way. But it's something Oscar has to figure out because all of the momentum is in Lando's favor, and at least some of it's in Max's favor too. But it's certainly not in Oscar's favor. And he is watching this championship slip out of his hands because he had a lead that a lot of us thought was untouchable. And now here we are 4 race weekends to go. He doesn't have the lead anymore. This will be very, very interesting to watch play out, and I'm very excited to see just how Oscar bounces back after this weekend. And will it continue for Lando? And will he surge ahead and win his first Drivers' Championship? Going to Red Bull, again, a good recovery drive for Max Verstappen, but still a disappointing weekend for him overall, because we thought this was probably a track where Red Bull was going to come out ahead of the McLarens. Just with that straight line speed, with just the track characteristics, the thin air, how much McLaren struggles in straight line speed, how strong the Red Bull car has looked lately. I thought Max was going to come out on top this weekend, but he could never find any pace in that car all weekend long. And that's very concerning for Red Bull, because they've been on a string of races lately where they've looked like probably the strongest car. So to come into this race weekend with those expectations and just completely drop the ball, something that's really going to hurt the team and hurt Max. And like I was saying before, we're going to tracks that are a little more favorable to that McLaren car. So could it be over for Max Verstappen's championship hopes? Again, he's coming out of this race weekend 35 points behind Oscar Piastri in second, 36 points behind Lando Norris in first. It's not over, especially if these two McLaren drivers come together again like we saw in the sprint race in Austin. If they have a mechanical issue, you never know what can happen. We've seen a lot of end-of-season chaos when it comes to championship fights in this sport, so it's certainly not out of the question. But 36 points with 4 race weekends to go is a huge deficit, and it's concerning for Red Bull and concerning for Max that McLaren's figured it out again, and they've gotten back on top of their car, and they've looked like the strongest car again. And a 30-second lead, or 30-second win for Lando Norris, very impressive, and sends a very strong message to the rest of the field, but especially to Max Verstappen. He could make it work. I just don't know if it's possible, and I don't really know if I like his chances going into these final 4 race weekends. But at least for Sunday, it was a very good recovery drive from Max. I think he was helped out a lot by the strategy call of starting with the mediums, going onto the soft tires. I was a little pessimistic at the start of the race as that was all unfolding, thinking, gosh, they blew it on this one, because Max did get undercut by the Mercedes, by Oscar Piastri, by Lewis Hamilton after those first rounds of pit stops. Drops all the way down to P8, but he was on the much better tire. And that soft tire was really, like, without a doubt, the strongest tire this weekend. And that gave Max the pace to get around a lot of those drivers and catch up. And I thought it was going to be a P2. I think all of us thought it was going to be a P2 because he was closing down on Charles Leclerc very quickly. But a little bit of misfortune there with that virtual safety car with Carlos Sainz at the end of the race, which took him just out of contention to get around Leclerc during those final few laps. But still a pretty good recovery drive for him to make it all the way up to P3. Should have been a P2, but at least make it up to P3 after a very, very disappointing qualifying on Saturday that saw him fall all the way down to P5. And also, too, after that start of the race where it was, he's going off track. I don't know how he didn't crash into the barriers going into the grass in that moment on lap 1, but good race for Max, just unfortunately not the race he needed for his championship hopes. Disappointing Sunday for his teammate Yuki Tsunoda. Started the race in P10, finished in P11. Had the similar strategy, starting on mediums, comes in on lap 37, switches to the soft tires. Did help him, but that pit stop was brutal for Yuki and really ruined his race. Dropped down to 15th after that pit stop, and that was because it was a 12-second pit stop. He was clearly not happy about this after the race. We saw some onboards from his car as he's getting out of the car after the race finishes and he parks in the pits. Clearly frustrated, walking off to go get weighed. But tough race for Yuki because that first stint really hurt him. And we saw that a lot after Oscar Piastri got by him on lap 11. He fell off significantly on those medium tires, just dropping second after second, lap after lap, getting overtaken by so many cars, dropping down the order. Tough race for Yuki, and unfortunately not one where he was able to come back and finish into the points. Now, I think he was saved a little bit. It wasn't the result the team wanted, of course, and not the result that he wanted, just for his future and trying to stay on this team and stay in Formula One and have a seat going into 2026. But at least for him, it wasn't all on him. And a lot of this came down to that very, very poor pit stop. Just again, a 12-second pit stop. There's not a lot you can do in a situation like that. So tough overall weekend from Red Bull. And also a tough weekend, too, because it was a weekend where we thought maybe they can come ahead in the constructors standings and come out, in second place out of this weekend. And that race is very tight because coming out of this weekend, we have Ferrari in second place with 356 points, Mercedes in third with 355, and Red Bull in fourth with 346. So a disappointing weekend for Red Bull because we thought it was a big opportunity for them to make some ground. Of course, for Max to make some ground in the driver's standings, but more importantly, for the team to make some ground in the constructors and make it all the way up to P2 coming out of this weekend. And again, it's going to be difficult for them to pick this back up during these final 4 race weekends because we're going to tracks where things should favor other cars a lot more than it should favor this Red Bull car. So, tough weekend for Red Bull, but it is still Red Bull, so we'll see how they can bounce back. Good weekend for Ferrari, at least for one of their drivers, Charles Leclerc, starting the race in P2, finishing the race in P2. Again, I don't know how he didn't get a penalty from that lap 1 incident. A little disappointing that they were lifting and coasting literally from the start of the race. I think it actually started after the first 10 laps, but still, I mean, this was a 70-lap race and we're lifting and coasting on lap 10. So, not what you want to see. I guess it's a problem that they're going to have to deal with for the rest of the season. But still disappointing for them. But at the same time, at least they still had this pace lifting and coasting because they look like the strongest car. And I think with a little better strategy, they probably would have held on to that P2 position a lot more favorably. And I think it wouldn't have come down to those final laps. Now, Charles clearly got saved by that virtual safety car. And that without that, I think he's finishing this race in P3. But a really good result for him, and at least somewhat of a promising result for Ferrari. I don't think they're winning any races this year. McLaren's probably going to win in Brazil. If anyone else, it's probably going to be Max. I think Mercedes wins in Vegas. Qatar, McLaren. Abu Dhabi, probably McLaren or Red Bull. I can't see Ferrari winning any races this year unless it's some weird situation where these 3 top teams get completely taken out and the doors open for Ferrari to walk into a victory. But at least they can hold their hat on a P2 finish like this and a good result for Charles Leclerc. And again, a result that puts them, not by much, just 1 point, but puts them into P2 in the constructors standings coming out of this weekend. It was a different story for Lewis Hamilton, though. Started the race in P3, ends up finishing the race in P8. Just a messy race from him. Again, I think, I thought Charles should have gotten a penalty for that incident with Lewis going into turns 2 and 3. That obviously hurt Lewis, but he did get hurt by that incident with Max going off into the grass, picking up some floor damage, getting that penalty. Just a messy race from him. And probably a situation with that penalty that took him out of contention for a podium. Of course, the floor damage itself probably would have anyway. I was a little surprised the team didn't ask him to give that position back to Max in that moment. I don't know if Lewis would have. He probably would have fought it a little bit. But I think that probably would have been the better call for the Ferrari pit wall to make, and something that probably hurt Lewis because that 10-second penalty was brutal for him. And when he did come into the pits for that first pit stop, he ended up losing positions to Ollie Bearman, Kimi Antonelli, George Russell, Oscar Piastri, all because of those 10 seconds he had to sit in the pit lane before the pit crew was able to do any work on his car. But after that too, and I guess this probably comes down to the floor damage, he just fell off in that middle stint before he came in for his second stop on the soft tires. He was on the mediums, which again, it proved out to be a pretty bad tire for this race. But he was nowhere. Just falling off. You thought at first maybe he could catch back up to Oscar, but Oscar just easily pulled away from him. But at least for Lewis and at least for the team, again, they came out of this weekend in second place in the constructors standings. So we'll see just how strong they can come out, or strong they can look in these final 3 or 4 race weekends. They're going to need a little bit of help because they're not tracks that should favor them. But there is something to take away from this weekend because I did not expect Ferrari to look this strong. So that was at least a positive for them. Going to Mercedes, okay weekend for them. Not really the best. I don't think they really had the highest hopes. George Russell started the race in P4, finishes in P7. Kimi Antonelli starts the race in P6, finishes in P6. We got some great radio messages from George Russell. Of course, all of the ones about Max at the beginning, just with him not getting a penalty. Again, don't really agree with George's stance in his radio messages in that moment. But for a lot of these drivers, it's like, you might as well try. Who knows what the stewards are going to say? Who knows what they're going to, how they're going to interpret these radio messages, if it'll lead them into investigating something. So a little annoying sometimes, but you can't really fault drivers for at least getting on the radio and saying something. But then we got some more radio messages from George as he's catching up to Kimi Antonelli. He feels like he clearly has the better pace than Kimi, wants team orders to swap around because Oscar is closing in behind him. They finally swapped positions on lap 41. It took a little bit of coaxing from George saying, hey, look, I will give the position back to Kimi if I cannot catch up to Ollie Bearman. Of course, he doesn't end up catching up to Ollie Bearman. They end up swapping the positions back at the end of the race. A little bit funny from Kimi right away when Oscar ends up getting by George with Kimi saying, we got to switch the positions. We got to swap the positions. Now's the time. I love Kimi's radio messages and just how frantic he sounds. Always brings me back to the Kimi Räikkönen days. And, of course, Kimi has a little bit more personality than Kimi Räikkönen, but still just the frantic radio messages that we get from him, a little reminiscent of those days. But a little bit of a tough weekend for Mercedes because they just didn't really have the pace to keep up like they would have hoped to. Now, again, both of those drivers came in for a second stop to get on softs for the end of it. I would have liked to see Mercedes just keep one of them out and say, what have we got to lose? Why don't we see if we can hold on? Now, hindsight, I don't know if it would have worked based on how we saw these soft tires perform during this race and especially at the end of the race with those drivers on the soft tires able to close up. But I just would have liked them to see, hey, maybe we can get something out of this. Maybe the result can be a little bit better, especially with how many drivers came into the pits for that second pit stop. Could have given you a podium if you were able to hold on, but a little bit of a disappointing weekend for Mercedes because they lose P2 in the constructor standings. But again, they're only 1 point behind Ferrari. We have seen them look okay in Brazil. It's not out of the question for them to maybe win that race or at least get on the podium in Brazil. We'll see how it all plays out, but then Vegas, I think, is the one they have circled on their calendar. They won that race last year, of course. It's a track that should suit their car very well. And track conditions, too, with it being a night race, it's usually pretty cold in Vegas at that time of year. Should be very, very favorable for Mercedes. So there will be opportunities for them to get back ahead of Ferrari, stay ahead of Red Bull. They're going to need some help, though, but maybe at least with this. We know where Ferrari stands. We know Mercedes can beat Ferrari every other weekend, but probably a little promising for them that they saw Red Bull struggle so much this weekend. All right, let's get to these midfield teams. Usually I don't start with them, but they deserve it this weekend because Haas had an incredible weekend, of course led by Ollie Bearman. Started the race P9, ends up finishing P4, tied for the highest finish for the team in their history. What a race by Ollie Bearman, and what a driver he is turning out to be because we've got an incredible rookie class. Of course, Isaac Ajar, we've got Gabriel Bortoleto, but Ollie Bearman, all three of those have showed us so much promise and shown us that they're going to be in this sport for a very long time, and they have the talent to do so. But this was an incredible race by Ollie. A lot of it came down to the start. He gained 3 positions all the way up to 6th place on the first lap. Ends up getting up to 4th place because of Max and Lewis fighting on lap 6. But he had the pace. I thought after that moment, okay, he got ahead of Max Verstappen, but I mean, this is a Haas. Max is in a Red Bull. Max is going to catch him up easily. But he pulled away, and he held him off. And it was just incredible to see. Now, there was some advantage, of course, with Ollie being on the soft tire. That was a much stronger tire, and Max being on the medium. So that did help a little bit. But just the pace that we saw from Ollie this race weekend, very impressive. And I don't think this was a one-off. This was a freak thing. This wasn't anything that was helped by penalties or chaos or crashes. This car is fast. And we saw that, of course, with Esteban Ocon. Started the race P11, ends up finishing the race P9. Not as high, but it is clear that this Haas upgrade that they brought in Austin, I think they brought a second phase of the upgrade this weekend. It's working out for them. And it's putting them in a very good spot in the constructors' standings, because this was a huge points haul for Haas, where they're now, how much did they win from this race weekend? I think it was, let's see, 14 points out of the weekend. And all of the midfield teams around them, other than Sauber, who got 1 point, everyone else went scoreless. And that is a big thing for Haas, because it brought them up to 8th place in the constructors' standings. We've got Racing Bulls in 6th with 72 points, Aston Martin in 7th with 69, Haas in 8th with 62, and Sauber in 9th with 60. Very close. And Haas brought themselves right back into contention to make some noise in this midfield battle. And these are millions of dollars on the line, depending where these teams finish in the standings. And that can go a long way for teams that don't really have the resources that the top teams have, don't have the facilities, don't have the team personnel. The prize money and the difference in the prize money between these positions can go a very, very long way. But things are looking good for Haas, because I don't think this was just a Mexico City thing. I think they're probably going to look strong in Brazil. I think they're probably going to look strong in Vegas too. Could look strong in Qatar, and they could look strong in Abu Dhabi. So a lot is left to play for this team as we continue into the final 4 race weekends of this season. But I like them probably. Of course, Williams is still the top midfield team. I don't think anyone is going to touch Williams. But at least from 6th place down to at least 9th, I mean, Alpine is cemented as the last place team. Nothing's going to change that. But I think Haas might be the favorite to make it up to 6th place in the constructor standings. Just a huge weekend for them. A little disappointing. I thought we were going to get an Ollie Bearman podium halfway through this race. In the moment, I was hoping they would have kept him out and wouldn't have brought him in for that second stop on lap 48 for the soft tires. But hindsight, looking at how Max Verstappen closed in on Charles Leclerc, he would have closed in on Ollie. He would have been able to overtake Ollie and would have taken away that position. So ultimately, I don't think it was necessarily something that cost them any positions. But yeah, huge weekend for Haas, and a very, very important weekend for them coming out of this weekend for the constructor standings. A good weekend for Sauber too. Now, they did come away with 1 championship point, but again, all of the other midfield teams came away with nothing. So at least they gained some ground. Now, they did lose some spots. Of course, Haas jumping them, pushing them back down into 9th, but still a good weekend, and they still showed some promise. Gabriel Bortoleto started the race P16, ends up finishing P10. He started on the mediums, switched over to the soft tires on lap 38, so that, I think, helped him a lot, because I think that was the ideal strategy for these drivers for this race. But a brilliant start from Bortoleto, too, gaining 3 positions at the start. He ends up passing Isaac Ajar at the end of the race. Isaac Ajar. I keep messing up on that. Got to remember, we got to pronounce his name the right way. But ends up passing him for that 10th place position on lap 63 at the end of the race. Really big moment for him to get into the points and get at least 1 championship point for this team. Disappointing race for his teammate, though. Nico Hülkenberg started the race P13, makes it halfway through the race, but ends up retiring on lap 27 with some power unit issues, and some issues that the team saw right away at the start of the race on the formation lap. Little concerning for Sauber, because we've seen this problem happen for them a handful of times, where one of their drivers, usually it's been Nico, is on the formation lap and something's going wrong with the car right away. Have to retire, call it a day early. So disappointing result for Nico, especially too, starting P13. Could it have been a double points finish for the team? Might have been, and that might have helped them hold on to that 8th place position in the constructors standings. But at least for them, they look very strong this weekend, and they showed some pace, and that could help them as this midfield battle continues, because again, it is very close between P6 and P9 between these 4 teams. Williams, tough weekend for them. Alex Albon starts the race P17, ends up finishing P12. Carlos Sainz and it starts the race P12, but ends up retiring in the final stages of the race. Just a tough. I mean, they just didn't get it right with strategy, I guess. At least with Alex Albon. Started him on the hard tires. He was nowhere during this race because of that move. The hard tire was awful. Turned out he gave some valuable data to the rest of the teams because they saw how bad the hard tire was and scared them away from using it. But just a tough result for him. And also, too, once you're on the hard tire, you're kind of stuck, especially since you started it on the race, because you have to make it to a certain point, at least close to halfway through the race, before you can switch on the mediums. And then at that point, it was a very obvious choice to switch on to the softs, and there's only so much you can do to save the race at that moment. But very frustrating race for Alex Albon, and we got some more sassy radio messages from him where he was clearly not happy with the team and being very vocal about it. It's always interesting, though, when you hear Alex Albon, because he's just so quiet and comes across so polite, and to see him fire back at the team. Now, these are radio messages in the heat of the moment, so you do understand it. The competitive juices are flowing. But always a little bit interesting to see that too. For his teammate, Carlos Sainz, he did start on the medium, switch over to the softs, but had some weird things going on with his car. Obviously something going on mechanically with the pit limiter. Watching the onboard of him coming into the pit lane, very bumpy. He obviously wasn't able to control his speed because he got a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. And usually in those moments, we see a driver pushing as hard as they can coming up to that pit limiter line, locking up the tires, not slowing down fast enough. That's where they get the speeding in the pit lane. That wasn't the case with Sainz. He slowed down just fine. It didn't seem like he locked up. It didn't seem like he was swerving or losing the car coming into the pit lane trying to slow the car down. It seemed like a normal entry into the pit lane, but it just was too fast. And I think there was some mechanical issue with his car that really stopped him from controlling the speed. But he gets a 5-second penalty for that. Comes into the pits again. Speeds in the pit lane again. Gets another drive-through penalty. That, of course, just completely ruined his race. And then he has that moment at the end where he spins out. I don't know if he needed to retire the car. I think he was just done at that point thinking, all right, it's over. We're not making anything out of this race. So DNF for him ultimately. Tough weekend for Williams. But at least for them, they're in a pretty good position in 5th place in the constructors standings. They've got 111 points. You've got Red Bull ahead of them with 346. They're obviously not catching them. It's mathematically impossible for them to catch them. But then they've got Racing Bulls with 72 points behind them. Good for them that Racing Bulls didn't pick up any points this weekend and capitalize on a poor weekend from Williams. So they should be in a good spot. Not the results they wanted, but again, the focus has always been for 2026 for Williams. So they should be in a good spot moving forward, and it shouldn't hurt them too much to have weekends like this. Poor weekend from Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso starts the race P14, ends up retiring on lap 35. Very interesting situation with him, where I'm kind of wondering, did Fernando give us the old Fernando and just say, I'm out. I'm not doing this race anymore. I don't like how this is going. I'm not driving the car anymore. Because what happened was the team asked, I think it was right before that, lap 32, 33, Lance Stroll is behind Fernando. The team gets on the radio, asks Fernando to swap positions and let Lance by. Fernando does it, then starts drifting his car. Kind of looks like he was having a little bit of fun with that. Then comes into the pits, and the team clearly was not expecting him to come into the pits, because when we see a mechanical retirement, like this looked to be at first, the pit crew's out there waiting to prop the car up on the jacks, plug up the intakes, bring him back into the garage, do it the right way. Fernando comes into the pits and no one's out there. He parks the car, he gets out. No one was expecting him to come in. So I really think this was a Fernando just saying, all right, that's how it's going to be. I'm out. I'm calling it a day. I'm getting in the shower. I'm getting back into comfortable clothes, doing my media duties early. Tough result for his teammate too, though. Lance Stroll starts the race P19, ends up finishing P14. He started on the soft tires, ended up switching to the medium tires. He did have a spin on lap 1 that put him back to the back of the order, but at the same time, he was able to make his way up the order a little bit. just didn't have the pace. And a little disappointing for them because I thought the Aston Martin car was going to look a lot better than it did this weekend. But they just didn't have any speed around this track. So tough weekend for them, especially with Haas closing the gap. And Haas is now only 7 points behind them. But fortunately for Aston Martin, like a lot of these midfield teams, it was only Haas and Sauber that came away with points this weekend. So at least they were able to maintain some of that ground in the constructors' fight. Another team that had a pretty disappointing weekend were the Racing Bulls. Isaac Ajar started the race P8, ends up finishing P13. Liam Lawson starts the race P15, ends up retiring just a few laps into the race. Starting with Isaac, started on the medium, switch over to the soft tires. I thought that should have helped him a lot more than it did, but he could not make up the ground on that second stint. I think he probably was hurt by so many of those drivers coming in for a second stop to get back on the soft tires. That kind of neutralized things. Obviously put him on much more used soft tires. But again, this car just didn't have any pace this weekend. They had it in qualifying, at least Isaac did. But during this race, they did not have any pace and were just struggling and struggling and struggling. For Liam Lawson, though, tough race for him. Gets that wing damage on lap 1. Has to come in early for that pit stop. Switches onto the hard tires, so I'm sure they were thinking, okay, maybe we can make it to the end. But clearly something was wrong with that car because he ends up retiring a few laps after that. And again, has that very, very scary moment with the marshals and something that needs to be avoided. But good on Liam for at least recognizing that situation before it was too late and not giving us a catastrophic moment in the middle of that race. But tough weekend for Racing Bulls. At least they maintain that 6th place position in the constructor standings, but they're going to need to pick things up if they want to hold on to that position. Finishing things up, Alpine. What a surprise. Terrible weekend from them too. Pierre Gasly starts the race P18, ends up finishing P15. Franco Colapinto starts the race P20, ends up finishing P16. So you look at that on paper, think, oh, okay, they were able to gain some positions. No, they were the last to finish on track. They just got 15th and 16th because so many cars were tired, and those were the last 2 running positions. Tire strategy, Pierre was on the medium, switch over to the soft tires. He did have a good start on those medium tires too, which I was pretty surprised by, but the pace just was not there for this car, and that obviously caused Pierre to drop down the order and drop down pretty significantly. This car is just nowhere when it comes to the rest of this field, and hopefully Alpine has all of their focus on 2026, and hopefully they have a good car in store for that year because they're going to need it after this season because it has been rough. Franco Colapinto, though, his tire strategy, started on the hard tires, switch over to the softs. Again, any driver that went onto the hard tires during this race was hurt significantly because that tire was so slow. So, tough strategy call for him. But again, I guess you don't blame him for starting on the hards, not knowing the tire was going to struggle that much. But once you were committed at the start of the race, there was only so much that you could do. And they were just stuck, holding on, probably hoping for a safety car that could have given them some advantage at the end of the race. But that safety car never came. And just another tough result for this Alpine team. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode, recapping the Mexico City Grand Prix. What a race, what a weekend, and what a lot we have to look forward to in these final 4 race weekends, both in this driver's fight, but also in this midfield battle in the constructor standings. We're, of course, off next weekend, but then after that, we are off to Brazil, one of the best tracks on the calendar and one of the best tracks for racing. And fortunately, we've got a sprint race for that weekend too. I'll be back, of course, going into that weekend with another preview episode, followed by a recap episode, probably coming out on Monday, just based on when that race start is in the afternoon for me. But I will be back with another recap episode for that race weekend after the Grand Prix. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.